So, Dr. Mary Ghattas, you're here.
Hi, thanks
Welcome.
for having me.
You're Egyptian,
I am Egyptian.
but you're also a scholar of Egypt too, right? You're a historian. Tell us
Yes.
about yourself.
I am a historian of Christianity in the Middle East, and I focus on Egypt. I focus on modern Egypt. Um, let's see.
You do focus
Um,
on modern Egypt, but you talk about old stuff too, right? You like
yes, I
you
mean,
intersect with old stuff in your research and kind of setting up what life is like.
touches the work of a historian, you know?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Definitely.
everything relates. Um, yeah, the class I am currently teaching at Agora University talks about the history of the Church of Alexandria. So of course we start from before Mark.
Mhm.
We take a look at ancient Egypt. We take a look at who the Copts are before Christianity, because the term Copt has come to mean an Egyptian Christian. Like that's the connotation that it's taken on, especially after
Yeah.
centuries of.
Well, let me interrupt you just because I think, you mentioned a bunch of stuff that people may not know about, right? Like where because I'm not an Egyptian scholar, as you know, and as people you know, who follow the podcast or at least my work know. I like Egypt. I'm interested in it. I dabble, right? I think everyone we dabble in nearby fields. I've touched like ancient Egyptian language a little bit, Bohairic, Coptic, for languages. I've done a lot in the literature, but
Well, that's not what I heard.
what'd you hear?
So one of my like kids from church took your Jerusalem class at UCLA
Uh-huh.
years ago,
Yeah.
and you had written comments on her paper in Coptic, and she came up to me and was like, "Can you help me read this? I don't know what he's trying to say."
Do you remember what
So I
grade
feel
she
like
got?
you're a better cop than I am.
You know, in that case, I think she deserved it. Um, I I run a tight ship,
Mhm.
and when it comes to teaching, I'm a little off, but that's what makes me unique, you could say. And no, I think
I love your class.
no, she was a great student, that one. Because I wouldn't do that. I'm not running around like writing comments in Coptic on students' papers, but because I knew she was Coptic and what have you. No, I like it. I mean, look, Coptic as a language is tough. Compared to the Semitic languages, it's different. And there's so much going on. When you do Semitic languages, they're all cousins. So there isn't a lot of
You learn the system, and then there's like
yeah,
the.
right. You like, okay, these are how your neighbors talk. This is
Mhm.
how their neighbors talk, right? And it's kind of these are how their cousins talk. And when you think of it that way as kind of, learning language family, same with the Romance languages, right? A person from France is going to speak Latin this way. A person from Italy is going to speak Latin this way. A person from Portugal or Spain are going to speak Latin this way. And if you just think it like more about people and the differences in people, learning through a language family becomes pretty easy or doable, right? Like, and so you can do five or six languages without necessarily thinking, oh, I've got to learn five or six different language classes. Like, don't think of
Yeah.
it like that. You're learning one thing that, has a modification in this or that area. Whereas Egyptian language is tough. It's different. I mean, there's some similarity because it's
You
Hamida's.
learned Bohairic, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a
I learned
Sahidic
Sahidic.
textbook. I own a Sahidic textbook, but
Yeah.
what am I going to do with it? Like,
No, Sahidic actually has to be the simplest language I've ever learned. Like its beauties in its simplicity. Um, its grammar, its syntax, and its vocabulary is not too far off Bohairic. So I'm more familiar with Bohairic from the liturgy and from the church. Um, but Sahidic is simple. My professor used to say Coptic is like riding a bike, like you never forget it.
What kind of bike?
Learning Coptic is like riding a
Maybe
bike.
one of the like turn of the century bikes with a gargantuan front wheel and a tiny like little wheel you're trying to balance. That's what it's like for me. But look, my interest is in the ancient Near East generally, and so when I usually encounter Egypt, it's ancient Egypt, and I think um, we're pretty good in terms of what we publish in English about ancient Egypt, or even pop culture. Turn on History Channel or National Geographic. You get a lot of documentaries and stuff treating ancient Egypt, and then you look at modern Egypt today. Um, it's a different vibe. It's a different language. Like what happened, right? And I think there's this period that we don't know about. And the question I ask is, where did the pharaohs go, right?
Mm,
So, students of history, people, who've learned a little bit, they know, okay, Alexander comes into Egypt and, we get Alexandria, right? We get this city, Alexandria, because of Alexander. And we don't really hear about pharaohs much anymore. If you know Roman history, you know about Pompeii, you know about the Roman um, governance of Egypt. Egypt produces a lot of grain and stuff, but like, okay, these people who made pyramids, who made hieroglyphs, who have mummies, right? Like um, they didn't disappear. Like ancient cultures don't fully disappear. There's a lot that does, but I mean, part of that's just about living in any age. When you live in an age, the people groups grow, they develop. We have slangs, we have new fashions, new foods, stuff like that. All this happens everywhere. Um, but when, like a power structure, like the Egyptian empire doesn't exist, then what happens, right? It's not like Egyptians disappeared. I'm talking to an Egyptian. I'm talking to someone genetically like comparable to, yeah, right. Talking to somebody who is literally descended from those people,
yeah.
and
You
with
asked where the
that,
pharaohs went.
yeah, right. Howdy, you're talking to
Right.
one, right?
Yeah.
It's like on The Sopranos. I don't know if you ever watched that. There's in season one, there's a scene, where the Sopranos are shaking down a Hasidic Jewish guy, and
Okay.
he's boasting about Masada, and he goes,
Yeah.
"The Romans, where are they now?" You're looking at them, right?
Yeah.
So, um,
I remember that.
anyhow, what happened? Like, what happened to Egyptian culture? You mentioned things like marked liturgy. We talked about language. We talked about dialects. I imagine people who are, watching or listening to the podcast, they may not know any about that stuff, right?
Mhm.
So, let's start kind of with Alexander and what happens to Egypt. We don't have to get like too detailed, but just kind of arc it. Like there, at a certain point, ancient Egyptian language changes, right? And so,
Mhm.
if you're listening, you haven't heard about this, you've only heard about hieroglyphs or ancient Egyptian as a language. There's other key terms you could think about, like hieroglyphic, hieratic, and then later
Hieratic,
on something called demotic,
demotic.
right?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
let's talk about that
And
and how we get to Coptic. What does Coptic mean as a word? Like, what does that word mean? And then what's sort of the transition language wise, or um, I'll call it cultural, because, we have these external forces kind of running things, or at least at
Mhm.
the macro level.
Yeah. So let's start with the term Coptic. That stems from the Greek word for Egypt, Aegyptos, right? If you take away the prefix and the suffix, and you're left with Egyptos in the middle.
Yeah.
And
Gift.
that Gipt, right?
Yeah.
Gipt, Copt. That's what gives us in all the European languages, like the modern word for Egypt, Copt, and in Arabic, Copt or gift, like you said, Gipt, like you said. Um, so Aegyptos was the Greek word that um, Alexander the Great and his descendants used not just for Egypt, but also for the Nile River. Um,
It was for what?
the Nile River,
The
for
Nile
Egypt
River.
and the Nile River.
I
Mhm.
mean, that's cool, right? Like, ancient Egyptian words for Egypt. Do you remember the ancient Egyptian word for Egypt? I don't know if you ever.
Yeah, Hakapta, the house of the spirit of Ta,
I
of
was
the
thinking of
creator.
more like kemet.
Yes. Oh, so that's like the more Semitic stuff, right? That's
Well,
where you come in.
well, no, I mean, because it refers to, like you mentioned, the Nile. That's kind of what triggered it for me. It's like
Yes.
there's the black land and then the red
Kemet is the
land,
black land, the black fertile
the
land that you
fertile
get
land.
from the overflow of the Nile. And actually today, if you fly over Egypt, you can definitely like there is a very stark, very obvious line between the fertile land next to the Nile and the desert. Like it's actually it's real. Um,
That's a
which
great
like
point. Like, I hope we can come back to that too in the conversation because, you like, Egypt today, as a like the political geography of Egypt is basically a trapezoid or almost a square, right? Like it's
almost
got a
square.
right
Plus
angle.
Sinai.
Yeah, plus, Sinai. Yeah, and it's like, is that Egypt? Like, what qualifies as Egypt? And for the ancient Egyptians, it's where you can live in this hostile land, right? You live in the fertile land. And so the
Mhm.
fertile place you live is Kemet, the
Mhm.
black land, so to speak, but referring to, like the fertility of the Nile and how you can grow crops and you can survive and have a civilization there. Now, since a lot of people you know, a lot of the viewers or listeners of the podcast are language nerds like me, we can go back to your the Egypt, Copt,
Yeah.
and actually tie it to Kemet because the M in the middle, works labially like this B or P sound
Mm-hmm.
that comes out of the Greeks. So you could be hearing basically the same sound, Kmit, Kbit, Gipt, right? So there's a phonological spectrum between, like G and K, between, B and M, and then of course T is the same in either case. So anyway, nerd alert, but that's these are the
Well,
people
one of the
I engage
Semitic
with.
names is Kiftaim.
Oh, tell me
I don't know
more.
if I'm saying that right. Son of Mizraim.
Interesting. I hadn't
Yeah,
heard that. I know like the name Masr as we use today, like in Arabic,
in
um,
Arabic,
or Mitzrayim in Hebrew, Masrin in
Mizraim.
Syriac.
And that's named after the grandson of Noah who settled in the Nile Valley. And there is a town today in Upper Egypt called Gift. That's how you would pronounce it in the Saidi, right? The rest of us say Gift. Um, my family's obviously from the north.
Uh,
um, so yeah, and that's the in the neighborhood of ancient Thebes.
um, well, the etymology at least refers to the borderlands, and it was probably given by the Akkadian expansion, or at least designation for geography then. So it's a foreign name that's now like Germany, right? We don't like if the Germans refer to Germany as Germania instead of Deutschland. That's kind of what we'd have with Egypt and
Yeah,
Masar today. But anyway, let's go back to Copt and
Coptic. You mentioned Kemet was the Black Land. They also had a name for the Red Land, which escapes me at the moment. But for the desert around Kemet,
right.
yeah, because that was also seen as part of the country, at least the eastern desert.
So basically, Coptic is just a synonym for Egypt, right? Like it's just a different.
It's a synonym for Egypt. It takes on a Christian connotation, but um, that's not how it originally was.
How do we get there though? Like, so from Alexander to, later the Romans, like what's happening in Egypt, and then, take us to the period of Jesus, I suppose, and, the Holy Family. Like, how does Egypt, well, I mean, you could even start with language too. How do we go from Demotic to Coptic, right? I think part of that is the Eastern Roman or Mediterranean context. Because if you haven't seen Coptic, Coptic looks like funky looking Greek.
Mhm.
It's basically funky looking Greek with extra letters for sounds that Greek doesn't make.
With seven extra sounds. Yes. And if you are Greek and you hear it in the church, and the way we pronounce it, you're going to be like, this is Greek, but not Greek. But what's going on with you guys? Because
Yeah.
I think that's a good, it's a good analogy for who we are as a people. We're neither, we're neither Greeks, we're neither Arabs, but we are very much at home in both cultures, both of those
Mm.
cultures. Um, and when you take a look at our history, you'll see why. So Alexander um, comes across a sleepy fishing village on the shores of the Mediterranean called Rakotis, right? And that was the name. That name later became the name of the Coptic quarter of his city, right? I mean, we know that he conquered all throughout the East, and he named all these different cities Alexandria, right? Like, there's Alexandrias in, like, I don't know,
Yeah.
Pakistan or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Tajikistan. Um, the one he builds on the Mediterranean becomes the most important city in the Eastern Mediterranean up until like the fourth century um, of our current era. So, yeah, this is when he brings Egypt into the Hellenistic empire, the empire that he created, which then the Romans inherit, right? Um, but the rulers, to make themselves a bit more palatable to the Egyptian populace, um, they adopt their gods. Their gods kind of take on Greek names. There seems to be some sort of like syncretism between like Greek mystery religion and ancient Egyptian religion. Um, and even when you have these developments in Greek philosophy about the oneness of God, you have in ancient Egyptian mythology, you do have a concept of the oneness of God, you know, and then that is what allows
Like
uh,
Akhenaten, and the Amarna period.
Akhenaten with the Aten, right? And
Yeah.
the one God who is the sun, you know, um,
SUN.
SUN, not
Yeah.
SON.
Right, right.
But that
English
also helps,
problem. English problem.
yeah, but that also helps ancient Egyptians accept that God is light, that whole
Mm.
concept.
Right, right.
Uh, Obviously, that comes in from Jewish influences, which also Alexandria becomes um, the most important city of the Jewish diaspora
Hmm.
outside Jerusalem. It's the most popular, most populous city for the Jewish diaspora, which also tells us that, of course, it would be where the apostles preach their message. Yes, as well.
Prior
Well, I
to
want to talk about
apostles.
language because this is
Okay.
where we really get where ancient Egyptian becomes uh, less known, less used, right? With you have the introduction of Greek in the administration,
That makes
right?
sense.
Hmm. And
And
then
people who have heard of the Rosetta Stone too, like
mhm,
we're able to decode ancient Egyptian because of two things: Greek, our knowledge of Greek, and our knowledge of Coptic.
Coptic.
And
One of the people who worked on deciphering the Rosetta Stone was a Coptic priest.
oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Very cool.
he helped. What's his name? Champollion.
Champollion, yeah.
I forget the name of the priest that escapes me right now, but it's somewhere. So let's see. So when you have the Greeks, okay, so the Greeks are in power. Uh, their language is a language of administration. At the same time, you have um, the people who are really functioning in like hieroglyphic ancient Egyptian are the priests in the temples. Um, and it's not a language system that is used wildly outside of this
Mhm.
context. Um, so hieratic is a shorthand of these depictions or hieroglyphs. And then that develops into demotic, right? And then demotic is like what people use, right? And then that's what um, if you go to the if you go to the museums in Cairo, you'll definitely see ostraca and like just like writing exercises that children, that children wrote like back in the day,
Yeah.
and those were all in demotic. right? So they're practicing writing Demotic, and then um, that also at some point like just doesn't become functional for the people anymore. Like people are learning Greek and enable like in order to have like positions in government and all this stuff. And so they start developing, and you'll see there's a similarity if you put like Demotic next to the Greek. Um, like it's very obvious that the Coptic alphabet would be the baby. It looks like both, you know. And then plus seven sounds that are not available in Greek. Um, and they are Shai, Phi, Chai, Hori, Jinja, Chima, and T. Like these sounds are in Coptic words. You would definitely hear them if you walk into a Coptic church.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and probably, but this is way I'm saying a lot about the church because that's where the inheritor of this language is today. That's where you can find it today. I'm sure you can find families here and there, maybe in the deep south in Egypt, that speak this, but they're few and far between. The language changes again in the early 8th century in 705. This is like I don't know, about 20 some years after the Arab conquest,
Mhm.
uh, which during that like transitionary period, the Copts who were in government still used Greek for government documents and Coptic, but they had these Arab dressings, you could say, these Arabic dressings, right? So instead of saying like in Arabic, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, that would be written in Coptic, like in the opening document. Um, so that's, I guess, where you can see the first instances where you could see the functioning of the two cultures
Mhm.
together and how the Copts are really familiarizing themselves with it. Um, but ethnically, they're neither of these. When the Arabs came, they worked really hard to keep Islam as Arab religion.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they weren't really. I know the narrative that we hear now is, at least for the first like 20 years, the narrative that we hear now is, they presented whoever they conquered with three choices. It's either you convert pages, yeah, or you die. I think that was a later development because in these first few years where this, I mean, we also have to think about it this way. Like the Arabs were warring tribes in the peninsula. They've never been unified. They're finally unified under the banner of Islam, and then they take over huge provinces of the Roman Empire. They're still like keeping the Byzantine structure of the state, but like dressing it in an Arab way, and they're still trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
So, in that period, when you had people from Egypt who converted, people from Egypt and Syria who converted to Islam, they still had to pay jizya because the whole idea is they want large tax paying base for their new state. How else are they going to fund it?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So that's the story of how the Copts changed, how the Egyptians changed their language twice.
Would you consider
We
Coptic a
could say
language
1.5.
change?
We could say
Maybe.
1.5 changes because Arabic is a change. Arabic is a significant change.
Right.
Um, Coptic, I'd say it's maybe an adaptation, a response.
Yeah, maybe not quite to the level that English changed when the French conquered, right?
Mm,
So, we had Anglo-Saxon, as it's called, or Old English. And then when, the Normans come and conquer, we get all these, you know, francophonic words, Latin words that are, from French. And so the whatever we're speaking today is kind of a hybrid in like or as English. It's a hybrid of those two, the Germanic side and the Franco-Latin side. Um, Coptic, it's kind of like that. But I think, and maybe like you could speak to the dialect, I guess. It probably is dialect dependent or even document or corpus dependent, right? Where You'll have more Greek influence in certain dialects. Maybe Alexandrian, Bohairic, you can have more
Go
Greek.
higher for
You
sure.
know, yeah, you go to the south or Upper Egypt, and it's going to be more Egyptian. I like in the liturgy, I always remember uh, you know, the distinction between agios or theos. I'm like, okay, that's Greek, I got it. And ethnotia theweb. And I'm like, okay, that's different. That's different.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the first one
Um,
I said in Greek, which the Copts use liturgically, and the second one is, Coptic, Egyptian Coptic, used liturgically too for, holy are you, O God, basically, right?
but even then it tells like the Greek parts are mainly like what the clergy say, right? So and then that stems obviously from Alexandria. So you have what they believe to be six different dialects of Coptic today. The two main ones are Bohairic and Sahidic, and that covers the north-south divide. Um, and so then there are a lot of different sub dialects. So you
Mhm.
have Achnemic, sub-Achnemic, Oxyrhynch, from Oxyrhynchos,
Oxyrhynchitic. What a fun name for a
Oxyrhynchic,
dialect, right?
um,
Fayumic.
Fayumic, which is in between current, a little past Giza. So you're north compared to like Oxyrhynchos and Achmim. Achmim is like, so,
Yeah.
um, so you'll definitely hear if you walk into a Coptic church and if they are using Coptic because in the diaspora we don't as much.
Hmm.
Um, we're not as attached, unfortunately, to our language as some Semitic people. Um,
It's true.
yeah, I remember once I met and she spoke Aramaic. I want to say she was Assyrian. I'm not positive. Um, if she was Assyrian or if she was from, I guess it doesn't matter with the modern borders. Um, and she was like, "Oh, you're Coptic. That's so cool. But you guys lost your language. Why'd you lose your language? You should get it back." I was like, "Okay." She was like, I don't know, 17. So I was like, That's like nice passion for it." Um, and she's like, "Jesus spoke our language. We're never gonna let it go." And I was like, "Okay, that's a good point. Like if I knew Jesus spoke our language, maybe I'd hold on to it a little better."
Well, a lot
Um,
did. A lot of the, Middle Eastern Aramaic speaking Christians lost their language. Some hold fast to it for sure. I mean, there's a couple million speakers of different dialects of Aramaic today. But what's weird about like Egypt is like just in history, ancient Egypt doesn't really, I mean, we don't have data for it, but it seems that they're fine communicating in Akkadian, the language of Mesopotamia, as the lingua franca, right? Like the common language for international discourse and communication, back in the Bronze and early Iron Age. And so they're not like putting Egyptian like in the scribal houses of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Babylonian or Assyrian empires or anything like that. Instead, they're using Akkadian. They're kind of keeping and preserving Egyptian for Egyptians. Now, like there's archaeological, finds that go, reflecting the up into Syria, right? As far as Syria, that reflect sort of the push of different Egyptian empires and forts and bases and things like that. But it doesn't look like people are learning Egyptian, right? But people are learning Akkadian in Egypt. And so we have a lot of interesting peripheral Akkadian going into Egypt. But what's weird is like, just to the point you're making, uh, from an early era, you see uh, Christian Arabic, right? Because the Egyptians have adopted Arabic at like an earlier phase than say like
earlier than
this. the Syriac speaking communities, Assyrians, the Western, Syriac speaking communities too.
Oh,
They
I
like
totally thought the Western Syriac communities adopted it way earlier than we did.
no, and in fact, what's interesting, and look, this might depend on your ecclesiastical tradition, but it's only in recent years that you get a lot of um, material translated from Syriac even into Arabic, because like that's a new thing. Now that's not universal. I mean, like even in the Middle Ages, Bar Ebroios, publishing things in Arabic, and we have um, Abu Ra'id al-Takriti and people like this in Iraq who are, functioning in Arabic, stuff like that. You have the Rum Orthodox or the Antiochian Church that, um, they're in Syriac for a long time. Syriac is the language of the Antiochian Church. Just for people who are familiar with the Antiochian Orthodox, like they're a Syriac church until like they're fully Hellenized. And once they're Hellenized, then they're Arabized after that. And so you don't have that connection to the Syrian past like you did before. But you get a lot of authored stuff out of Egypt in Christian Arabic. But anyway, that's just an aside, for how
That's in like the late ninth, early 10th centuries
when you're getting Christian Arabic in Egypt, you mean?
when you're getting it. Yeah, when you're getting tracks composed in Arabic.
So it's like 300 or 200 to 300 years basically after the conquest. Is that?
But even then, it's an argument. It's an argument among the Copts. Um, you don't have until I want to say the 12th century. Um, you don't have patriarchs saying we have to pray in a language that the people understand. So okay, we're getting clues as to like how much Coptic is being lost and Arabic is being adopted. In the 14th century, 14th, 15th century, you have a new document that comes up called the Sulam or the dictionary, right? And that has um, it's a Arabic word and its Coptic equivalent, and its purpose is to preserve the Coptic language. So at this point, how much Coptic has been lost and how much Arabic has replaced it. I'm not like a this is probably very like other cops are going to be really upset at me. I'm not a very like gun ho for Coptic language. I think we've done. Some people will tell you, oh, it's the language of the conqueror. I think we've done really beautiful things with the language of the conqueror. I think we've done really beautiful things with um, adapting Coptic to like or from ancient Egyptian to Coptic to make it more palatable um, for the context of what's going on for the people. I think we've also done really beautiful things with that. And maybe our strength as a people is not holding on to the language, it's adjusting. It's taking from this culture and this culture and making something beautiful. Like we have all of these conversations now in the diaspora, right? Because we're all over the world. Um, and you can stream from any church anywhere in Europe. I'm going to use Europe as an example because of all the different European languages, but yeah, we pray in Arabic, we'll pray in some Coptic, but we'll also pray in Danish.
Yeah, right.
Like they'll do the midnight praises in French. Like I was thinking about this last night because we just had our festal liturgy for the Nativity last night. Okay, so the rhythm goes really well with the Coptic language. It goes well with Arabic. When you try to translate the verses into English, something gets lost in the melody.
Why do you think that is?
I'm trying to figure it out. I think maybe because Western language isn't made for Eastern melody. Like, I don't know.
I think that's fair. I mean, look, it's the same issue in the Syriac tradition, right? You have Syriac liturgy, well, but for, I don't know, when I'm in people will say, oh, I don't like the English service. I don't like English liturgy. Like, well, no kidding, you don't like it. It's because when you chant in Syriac, you're chanting. It's beautiful. And then you're
Yeah.
a native Arabic speaker. So when you chant in Arabic, you're really chanting. It's beautiful. And then, when you get to English, you're like, again, we commemorate her who is worthy to be blessed and remember. But you're saying it out of spite. You're just reciting it. Of course, you don't like it, but I think is also fair.
Well, we don't recite anything. We sing everything. We sing it drawn out, like
But we
Um,
do too, unless you're bitter and jaded that you have to do an English language liturgy in which you just recite it
Oh.
and kind of like, well, I appeased them. I did it in English. Um,
So
but
what happens in I mean, there's a large Syriac diaspora in Scandinavia. So what
yeah,
happens? They have to learn Syriac and Arabic in order to worship.
probably. I can't speak for, I don't know. I could ask someone. I'm sure I know that there's, people from Sweden who subscribe,
Mm.
and so if you're
Yeah,
listening,
let us know in the comments.
yeah, no, for real. Like how do you do it? Is there any local language? I don't know that they use German, um,
We use
liturgically.
German liturgically.
You should. I mean,
We
yeah,
do.
it's very difficult to chant in German, but like it's still. I think our European communities seem to be less. I don't want to call them less integrated because that I don't know that experience, but I get the impression that like even in Sweden, the government will pay the immigrant communities for immigrant specific programs. So it's easier to kind of maintain the foreigner within the country
Got it.
identity.
Not like
If
assimilated.
I'm wrong, anyone chime in. I have no idea.
Yeah.
This is my hunch, right? But in the US and Canada, like people make an effort to pray in the language. And so we've even had the liturgy translated with the melody. And so that I think it actually works, but I do get this, the general point that Eastern melodies, like they're not um, always adaptable to Western sensibility. Like in the West, you'll have more major keys, right?
Mhm.
In our singing, the way I don't know, attitudes, music, intonation stuff. It's mostly minor,
Mhm.
and Barry Broy even comments on that, right? Like he comments on it theologically. There's a reason for the minor melody, you know. Um, so that could be it, We've also, I don't know. I mean, it's a question of like, how do we adapt and lose our folk styles, right? You know, listen to old Western European folk style singing. It's kind of like here or there. You have a Sean No style in Ireland or something that maybe some pop bands will incorporate, into their musical traditions and stuff. Or we'll have like Appalachian chant, things. And some people have tried to like, place their Orthodox tradition within that context, which is kind of interesting. It's really cool. But I don't know. I mean, maybe that's part of the reason. Um, but Arabic and Coptic, they sound nothing alike though. And even Egyptian Arabic is a fusion, right? It's
Mhm.
Arabic for sure. And
Mhm.
people know it because of the Arabic media. Like you guys produce
We're the
it,
Hollywood of the Middle East.
you know,
Yeah.
more or less. See, I'm holding back all my jokes, but that's okay. You
Let's
know,
hear him.
they'll come. I'm drinking tea. If I had a glass of wine, they may come out a little easier. But
Mm.
yeah. Anyway, the rhythm of Egyptian Arabic is very different. You know, and just like the way, um,
I think
not
it's
just
it's definitely more influenced by Coptic than we ever give it credit for.
yeah,
And
sure,
that's because of the ethnic purity of the Copts. Like there wasn't much mixing in ancient Egypt because of the religion, the ancient Egyptian religion. So even if you had like the Romans come in, or the Greeks, very little, if any, mixing. And with the Arabs, we're not Arab. We're neither Arab nor Greek. But
do you think you could, like, you'll
and
probably push back on it, but I think it's in the key word is very little because it's not like there's no
No,
mixing,
it's
obviously.
very little. Very, very little.
You look at like Saidis, they have a look, right? So a Saidi is someone from Upper Egypt. Um, I can't just assume people know what I'm talking about. But Upper Egyptians, which is to the south, right? Like more, following the Nile toward its sources. Um, they have a different look than people who live in the Mediterranean, but that's not consistent. I mean, you have people who have that same look up in Alexandria, up in Cairo, and I don't know. It'd be. Have you looked at DNA stuff? This is just a random.
I did. I did. I had a initial very interesting reading
Oh, for yourself?
for myself, and then it changed. It changed to 100% Coptic, but before it was 80% Coptic, 10% Levantine, and 10% Hijazi. And I was like, Arab?
Yeah,
What? For the scholar that always says we're neither Arab nor Greek, I'm like reading my own DNA test, like, what?
yeah, right.
Um, but my my cousins and I did it because like we still kind of look different from like people that we go to church with. Like our family, we have straight hair. Like Egyptians don't have straight hair. Um, a lot of my cousins have like, and my sister too, colored eyes, light skin.
Yeah.
Mhm. Which, because of modern Egypt, some people will say like, "Oh, that's the French," but like we don't like saying that. The
Oh,
French are only in Egypt for like 3 years, and it just like doesn't, for a Middle Eastern family, it's like don't say that, don't say that about us.
I mean, blue eyes are only like what 11,000 BC, so it's not like it's a genetic mutation that exists everywhere.
Right.
It's just pervasive in certain regions. You
Yes.
know, and I mean, you look at ancient Sumerian figurines, they have the lapis lazuli eyes, and this is Sumer, right? So like basically Kuwait, Basra, like that part of Iraq, where it meets the Gulf. And there's a knowledge of them then and there, right?
Yeah.
So uh to what extent, I don't know. Like I don't I'm interested in it because I'm like interested in genealogy, and I think DNA studies are an interesting companion piece to that. A lot of times you'll like our profile matches our family history.
Hmm.
So, oh yeah, this person came from there. This person came from there. The only weird one is like on my Italian side, there's Greek, so it registers Greece. My thinking is, okay,
Southern
maybe
Italy.
say again.
Southern Italy.
Right. So our side comes from Mezzogiorno, which is like technically in the south, and that's like basically the southern half of Italy. Um,
Hmm.
So I'm thinking, what if we were just like Roman soldiers deployed to Greece, like
Hmm.
2000 years ago? And so they're taking samples from 1500 years ago, right? And comparing them. I don't know. Like there's so much about the DNA side I don't know. But you mentioned mixing and stuff, and you can look, there's always some sort of spectrum, the way appearance comes across. And one of the cool things about ancient Egypt is you have these like tomb portraits done in the classical era, right? Where like early icons come from that same style,
The
right?
Fayum portraits.
The Fayum portraits, right? And so,
Whenever people come to our church and they're like wondering who we are, I'm like the designated person to like read that. I tell them, look up the Fayum portraits and we'll play Find the Doppelganger. Like
yeah,
these people look like the people I stand next to in church.
that's true. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, I mean, like whatever the the spread of, or the genetic diversity of ancient Egypt is, it's ancient,
Mhm.
like it's ancient, it's there.
It's there.
It's attestable, like you can pull the DNA and then you can also compare the art, and the ancient Egyptians are good about this too. I mean, like the you can look at the table of conquered nations and different um, frescoes, or relief, and where we're lucky enough to still like have the color survive. Like a lot of color doesn't survive over time, and a lot of the art. But it depicts, both the facial features, the physiognomy, the um, complexion. These are the people who served ancient Egypt. These are the people who paid tribute to Pharaoh. Like stuff like that. And we got a pretty cool record of that. But anyway, that's a wild tangent.
I'm thinking back to last year when I went to Valley of the Kings and some of the colorful tombs I saw there, like the way the color survives. It's crazy.
It's almost miraculous. I mean, just the fact that whether it's the Amarna letters. So if you've never heard of that, those are these Akkadian language documents that survived, or these papyri, which is even more fantastic that they survived. That's organic matter, right? It's papyrus, right? It's made from plants, but it survived, several thousand years. That's not easy.
The dry climate in Egypt lends to that.
Lucky,
100%. Yeah.
lucky you.
Yeah. um, Another interesting aside too, I kind of want to talk about. I'm gonna jump forward and then come back to it.
Okay.
So when you were talking about the um, the Arabic Christian literature, I think one of the UK academics, I think her name is Ariada Papakonstantinou. She does a lot of work on the transition period from like Byzantine Egypt as a Byzantine province, to the Umayyad dynasty, the Umayyad state. And she talks a lot about the Umayyad and the Abbasid state. So during the Abbasid dynasty, the literature produced by the Coptic Church created an identity of the Church of the Martyrs. That's what they really um, drove home for the people. Now, I would push back and say that's not a created thing. That's something that's there. Especially if you look at the great persecution by Diocletian, by Decius, like the persecution by the Roman state. Tertullian even says if you put all the martyrs of the world on a scale, the balance would tip in favor of Egypt,
Wow.
the Egyptian martyrs. So that concept is there. But that also is there because of how ancient Egyptians viewed the afterlife. The resurrection of the dead is very, very normal. We can understand that. That's a very deep-seated belief in the Egyptian people. Also, we want to talk about martyrs. The very first martyr in the Coptic tradition was a man who showed hospitality to the Holy Family when they came to Egypt. Now, the Holy Family's trip to Egypt and their time, their refuge, it's almost legendary, the stories and the mythology around it. It's a very deep part of the tradition. And we know for sure how they came in through Sinai and then to the delta, like down the delta. And then when they go south, this is where we don't really know. Like as historians, we don't know. But if you look at the tradition is like, no, we have answers to all of this. The Holy Family stays in Egypt for some time, around 3 years. They stay at one site in the south for 6 months. But to the first martyr, who predates Stephen in the book of Acts, his name was Wadamun, and he was, and you can see in his iconography, he's dressed like a pharaoh, like he's very ancient Egyptian. So the story goes that he was worshiping God one day, and he had a vision of this family, and a voice telling him like, this is the true God. And so in the tradition too, wherever the Holy Family went in Egypt, all the idols toppled down, the idols in the temples toppled down. And so a lot of the people of the villages that that the Holy Family traveled to, they were on the hunt for them because they were like, who are these people destroying our gods are angry at this family, and we cannot show them hospitality. And so Wedemon finds them and he houses them in somewhere near modern day Luxor, I want to say. Um, he houses them. His neighbors find out about it. They're upset. They come kill him. Um, but before they do, Jesus tells him, because you showed hospitality to me, like this, uh, your name will be in this place. Um, and so to this day, there's a women's monastery that stands at this site, and they're known for their hospitality. But this martyr is very little known outside of Luxor.
Or Egypt. Well, I guess Luxor,
I
yeah.
would even argue that a lot of Egyptians don't know.
Yeah, no, I misheard. You're right. Wadamun, you said?
Mm-hmm. Wedemon in ancient Egyptian, Eudaimon in Greek. So he has both names in our tradition. And so yeah, again, this is a you want to talk about the Church of the Martyrs, this is something that happens when the Holy Family comes to Egypt. Um,
Yeah, I mean it's mentioned right in the early Gospels about the flight into Egypt, but we kind of,
mhm.
people in the West, like that's about it. Because
Yeah.
no one knows. I mean, people don't even know what the word Coptic is, let alone that there's still Christians there, and that their lineage goes back to Mark.
Yes, their ecclesiastical lineage, their apostolic heritage goes back to Mark. Like we mentioned before, Alexandria was the home to the biggest Jewish diaspora, right? And so we know that whenever the apostles went, and we know like their agenda, like whenever they went into a city, they went to the synagogues and they preached to the Jews, and if they were rejected, they went to the Gentiles. Um, and so we know that Mark came to Alexandria from, I want to say, intra traditional works. People from outside the tradition would tell you, well, we only know it from Eusebius,
Mhm.
right? Eusebius mentions the first 12 patriarchs of Alexandria, and then, but we don't know anything about them. We know from Demetrius, the vine dresser, on. And so there's a lot of very, as someone who's coming from the tradition, I can say this, there's a lot of very like funny academic reasons as to why. Um, I think the most famous is Walter Bayer, who tells you that Christianity in Alexandria was actually imported from Rome because it was Gnostic in the first few centuries. Um, but we have in the tradition we have the Acts of Mark that survive in Coptic and Ethiopic, and they've consequently been translated into Arabic and English, actually. Um, and I would argue that the memory of Mark, or Mark as an apostolic father, survives in all of Africa,
Yeah.
not just not just Egypt. So there's something to be said. That I think that's an argument for. Um, I mean, if we talk about Gnostic Egypt, it was there, right? Egypt is a very diverse religious place in these first few centuries of Christianity, especially, right? Um, you had Greek mystery religions, you had which kind of like bleed into the Egyptian ones, and then you have um, a lot of Egyptian magic happening, like even until way after the Arabs come to Egypt. Like this is something that I would argue that survives probably to this day, but like I'm very unfamiliar with the Egyptian magic manuscripts, so like I
Mm.
can't really think much to it. Um, but like for example, Justinian is the one who shut down the temple of Isis in Philae, the island of Philae. So like we're talking 6th century.
Right.
They're still going strong over there. Um, let's see.
It's a good
Uh,
point too, because when people talk about like the spread of religion, any religion really, but for example, Christianity, it's not like Christian Egypt means everyone's a Christian or everyone's
mhm.
canonical or like it's sort of that's the pervasive cultural trend, I guess. And Syria is like that too. And Syria, the Middle East is
The
like
Middle
that
East,
too.
yes.
There's
No,
still temples long after.
yeah.
A lot of Greek ones, especially. There's Mesopotamian tradition temples, like there's Assyrian style, but um, you tend to see more Greek things mentioned in the literature. Just since the Hellenistic period, they kind of imported, adopted, and maybe like syncretized with
Made it its own.
the Greek stories,
Yes.
and the Greek characters as opposed to the indigenous ones. But it's still there, it's there long after. And I mean, you have other groups that survive in different capacities, and sometimes they're like they morph into like a Gnostic community or like Yazidis, and there's people today who they have an ancient legacy, even though it's you know, like wildly, well, not wildly, but like it's considerably different than the literature we have access to from the ancient past. Doesn't mean it's not connected, but like what would Isis worship have been like in the era of Justinian? It's an interesting question. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure there was like a lot of Greek syncretism happening there. But that's such a good point. Yeah, you have a lot of different Christian groups. Like at the time of the Arab conquest, the number of groups vying for the title Church of Alexandria were 9.
Wow.
It's religion is not a one size fits all ever. I know like in the church, and even, well, I don't want to say in the church. I want to say in like the conqueror's narrative, right? So like maybe at some point this is the Coptic church. It's definitely um like after the Islamization of Egypt, it's like, oh, everyone becomes Christian, then everyone becomes Muslim, which is not the case. The population of Egypt did not tip in favor of Islam until the 15th or 16th century. And then at that point, you have a majority Muslim Egypt, but not before that.
Yeah, Middle East is a complicated place, and it's easy to,
Yeah,
paint it with a broad brush.
it's easy to romanticize, um, especially for these groups, for the church, for Islam. It's very easy to romanticize. Yeah, so Mark comes to Egypt. Um, the first few patriarchs developed the catechetical school of Alexandria. Right out of, I want to say there are like maybe 4 major schools before the catechetical school of Alexandria. And so this is like the Christian answer, and it takes students from all 4. Um, I'm sure people have heard of Hypatia, the world's famous uh, philosopher who's a woman in Alexandria. Um, her narrative is very interesting because it pits the church against the pagan Greek influences, which, really interesting aside, all of us know the story of Hypatia, is where the patriarch of Alexandria orders his parabolani, his like violent gang of monks, um, to kill her because, not in those exact words, but to in order to have Orestes, the city prefect, listen to him more effectively. Now, there is one narrative that survives out of this, and it actually comes from Mount Athos, where Hypatia is commemorated in its Nyxarium as a saint. and she's commemorated um, as a Christian, as a believer. And in this story of Hypatia, it's her, Orestes, and Cyril who are like a trifecta for the Christians in Alexandria, which then the Jews are threatened by. Jews of Alexandria are threatened by. And they kind of take care of it and make it look like it was Cyril's fault. So there's, if that narrative has no truth to it, in terms of Hypatia and Cyril, I think the one truth we can glean from here is the power struggles between the different religious groups in Alexandria in the fourth century. A philosopher who's gaining ground and a woman, right? And she has people's ears. She has important people's ears. And she really threatens like the structure of power in the city. And again, like we mentioned, it's the most important city in the Eastern Mediterranean up until I want to say like until Chalcedon, right? Because the Alexandrians ecumenically, and I guess this is a really big point like to make in this on this show too, is that the Christianity that comes out of Alexandria affects the Christianity of the whole world, right? Alexandria, the Church of Alexandria gives us the Bible that we have today in our hands, the biblical canon that we have today. It gives us monasticism, or an idea that like people can live for God,
Mhm.
right? And not for their jobs or their family or anything like that. But to live completely for God in community still, because humans need community. And I would say the third is the patristic heritage that you get from Alexandria, and what that means ecumenically. Why would anyone believe that the second person of the Trinity was incarnate, like truly? And what does it mean to say the Son of God and that he's eternal with the Father, and understanding not only like Christologically what's going on, but Trinitarian, like in the Trinity, what's happening? That I think that comes from Alexandria.
Well, of course, you're Coptic. I mean, I get it. I think there's a um, putting the Mesopotamian stuff aside, so much is dependent on Alexandrian, or it's mostly Alexandrian because that's the center where the conversations are happening. But this Egyptian or Alexandrian tradition, um, to a certain point, and then you don't hear about it anymore. But in the early, up till the first 5 centuries, you see even, Western Christians referring to the authors of those traditions because their works were so well circulated, and they're writing in Greek at that time, or at least, I mean, it looks like they're writing in Greek. That's the literary language, and it's the language, of the city of Alexandria itself, and those get circulated in those communities. But so one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation is just because I think, number one, I myself don't know as much about Egypt as I should. And I think a lot of people, we get kind of lost after Alexander comes, right? There's a lot of interest in ancient Egypt, but we kind of don't look at continuity, and we don't look at, these blank spots, and yeah, I mean, in a way, why should we, right? Like our history is built on what leads us to where we are, right? And say we, I mean, like in the West, right? Western, and all histories, right? Like people pay attention to their story. And so the histories they construct tend to lead them to that point. I get it, right? Um, you know, the sad part or the unfortunate part is we miss a lot of the things that maybe come after the fact that aren't coming to the development of these traditions. that go beyond who and what we are. And so Egypt is such an interesting case study because it morphs, like you said, it adapts. And so, like ancient Egyptian sensibilities, they adapt across time, they adapt into different forms. And, you know, it's always nice to know that, like, yeah, while the pharaohs went away, and this, I always
But
get
they
a kick out
didn't.
of it, but they didn't. Their genes are there, their language is there in the Coptic Orthodox Church. Um, and
And I
even
would
the
even
word,
say in Egypt's Muslims for the
yeah,
most part, because at some point their families convert. I do want to say, like, I mean, with today's global world, and there's a lot more like mixing. So I think in the next couple generations, that'll be very obvious because, like, I mean, modern Egypt is so significant economically for Africa and the rest of the Middle East. So you have people coming in and out all the time. Um, and and I think it's easier for Muslims than it is for Christians, to be completely honest. But I do know, like, I personally know a lot of people who have like married in, like, a lot of Christians who married other Christians. But I think it's easier for Muslims because it's like a just larger, it's a larger population. So
mhm,
you have a lot of North African mixing, like a lot of Tunisian Moroccan mixing. You have a lot of Levantine um, mixing, I would say. I want to say those are like the two popular ones, especially among the Muslims. A little bit from the Gulf, not too much, a little
mhm.
bit. Again, I can't give like a very generalized thing, but I want to say this is like from maybe the earliest we really see in the modern period is like two, maybe three generations ago. If we see it before then, it's in certain towns, like it's in Alexandria, or it's in certain towns with a large Greek population or Armenian populations, because you had a lot of Armenian refugees come in
Right.
from the genocide, and the Ottoman. How do I say this in a very PC way?
I don't know. I don't think you need to be PC. Like some people, look, the persecutions,
Okay.
right, that come in different forms and different
So from the
periods.
Ottoman persecutions, yeah.
I, for the sensitive folks out there, that doesn't mean like that that's the status all the time. I mean, there's good rulers and bad rulers, and there's periods of peace and prosperity, and there's periods of oppression
Yes.
and idiocy. So, look, it's a matter of history, and I don't. I think that we should be less sensitive about history and maybe just like my approach. I don't. I put no. I don't take any ownership of what came before me because it wasn't me. You know. Now it's easy for me to say I have a history of like my ancestors were on the good guys for 90% of the time. But okay, keep going back in time,
Yeah. Yeah.
and how many stories do we not know? Like how many people am I descended from that would have been like legit bad guys, you
Mhm.
know? Um, we're human. So anyhow, no, I appreciate the conversation. I think it's for me, it's about exposure, right? Like how do we know more about like history is important to me, not because of what was cool in the past, but because of how, we get to explore who and what we are and how, even if it's what we are is indirect, like how it influenced our world, you know. Um, and there's gaps in storytelling. And I think, where did the pharaohs go? Well, they're still here, kind of, in some way, they're still here. And if people want to learn more about it, I just say do like a search for the like Coptic is more the key term, for the the matter of continuity between ancient Egypt and the present day. And then there's any number of things that, one could study in the midst of that that become more specialized, right? Like Alexandria. So anyway, Thank you for coming. Anything you want to plug? Uh, Projects, publications, web presence? What you got
Yeah.
going on?
So I have my history class at Agora coming up, History of the Church of Alexandria, and that's where you can find me for the next couple months.
Oh, okay. Very cool. Thank you for having. We're going to have you back, I think. There's plenty of other stuff to talk about, especially some of the topics that we started to probably deserve their own show just because there's so
Mm.
much detail, um, that it's worth investigating further. And we didn't even get like into you know, your area of specialty, like your specialization, which is more in the modern period, or at least the early modern, right? Like not just today, but even like what leads up to today, and the role of Middle Eastern politics, sort of in the operation of minority groups in the region. So, anyways, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Lots of
Mike.
activity, and
Thank you.
we'll see you again.
Okay, sounds good.